Welcome back everyone to the second session of the third week of the Angular development course. In the last session we understood what is modules, and now let's just understand what are the directives. So directives are the utilities which helps to manipulate the DOM elements. So what is a DOM is nothing but the document object model or the elements that you see on your HTML page. So the directives are divided into three categories. So either they can be attribute directive, they can be a structural directive, or they can be a component. So understand that even a component is nothing but an subtype of directive, right? So what is an attribute directive is they only change the behavior of your DOM element in the HTML, but not the structure. So what it means is using attribute directive, I could like add new element, I could like, kind of manipulate any element in the screen, so on and so forth. But I could not change the structure. I means I cannot directly remove that structure or like directly just destroy the structure, so on and so forth. But if you want to do that, for that we have a separate directive called the structural directive where they affect the structure of DOM itself. So what I mean by that is, say assume like if user who is say a privileged user, like we want to show them some special controls on the screen. So this is something that is only available for a particular user. So when they kind of log into the screen, we would show a particular control to them. For rest of the users, we won't show that control itself on the screen. So those kind of functionalities are achieved using structural directives. Whereas attribute directives, I would say like, one attribute directive that we saw even yesterday was the ngFor directive, right? So wherein I said, if you have say a bunch of elements in the array and you want to show on the screen, you can simply use the ngFor directive to do that. Don't worry, we'll again get back into that if you don't remember. And finally, a component. So component is nothing but it's the directive with its own HTML template attached. So remember one thing, if you remember from the session yesterday, we discussed that a directive is something which only has the functionality attached to it, but not its own HTML. But if you want to also attach a HTML to a directive, that is called as a component, right? So component is nothing but a collection of a HTML along with its TypeScript. Whereas a pure directive can only have just its own TypeScript file. It does not has the corresponding HTML file. What we do is we import or we call that directive inside any of the HTML of the component in which we import it. Okay, so let's try to understand this in more detail. Let's get back to the code. And before we get any further, let me just tell you one thing upfront. So for coding your Angular, like doing any web development activity, it is normally preferred that you use Visual Studio Code. So if you are not aware of it, just go to the browser, open Google, and here you can just search for Visual Studio Code. And this is a free code editor which is provided by Microsoft, and you can download it for your Windows or whatever operating system you use from here. The advantage of using VS Code is it's really developer friendly, and even if you want to connect this with your GitHub account or like host it in some repo, you can do it. And also the other advantage of this is it also gives you a bunch of extensions which are really developer friendly. So for Angular, what I really suggest is there is the extension called as Angular language service. What you need to do is once you install your VS Code, just head to this last tab over here which is called extension, and once you click on here, you can just search for this particular extension called as Angular Language Service, which is provided by the Angular team itself. So you can click on, I have already installed it, but here you get an option to install it. You just install it. So what is the advantages? You can see the demo over here. So as you keep on typing, it will directly give you some suggestions based on what are the available options in that, and it really helps you to understand and also learn what are the things what are the various features that are available for the particular thing that you're doing, right? So going back, we were talking about directives. So let's try to understand it with some example. So as per the yesterday's example, if you remember, let's go back to the same example. So what I'm doing is in my app component.ts file, I've just inside the class, as I said, all your logic for your component will be coming inside the class. So inside this app component class, we have defined a variable like an array of the and assigned it to a variable called user, and we have just defined 4 elements inside this, right? And I said my requirement is like I have to now define like show each of this element on the screen. So how can I do that? So for that, in the way we do it in Angular is whenever you have to iterate. So the word to understand over here is iterate. Iterate means like I want to repeatedly like try to scan through an array or a list and get each element out of it. If I want to iterate through an any array or object, so I use something called as ngFor attribute in my HTML. So ngFor, as I said, is an attribute directive. So just understand one thing, okay? So as I said, a directive is of like two types. One can be your attribute directive and one can be your structural directive. So structural directive is something that which affects the structure of the DOM on your screen, And attribute directive is something where it just affects your properties on the screen. Like, it could affect your font placement, so on and so forth, but it cannot directly like remove or alter the DOM structure itself. So to understand if any directive that you're using is which directive, all you need to do is, once you have installed this Angular language service, you can just hover over it and you can just see over here like what is the directive type it is. So it will say like, here you'll get the tip that, this ngFor is nothing but a structural directive, right? So this is the advantage that I said of using your Angular language service extension over here. So it really also guides you in real time like what are the things you're using and how you're doing. And another advantage of using this Angular language services, so here now I've defined a variable called I and I'm just doing iterating it over here. What are these two brackets? Don't worry, we will also come back to it. It is called a string interpolation, which just means that, I'm just telling Angular that whatever is the value of this variable, just like, take it and put it in my HTML screen. So if by mistakenly like, you defined it as I over here and here you defined it by mistakenly by J. So what happens is this language service also gives you that ability to understand, like tell you upfront that, there is no property called as J in your component or in your HTML itself. So here itself, like, even before you run your application, you'll come to know that you have made a mistake and you need to correct it. So that is what is the advantage of using Angular language service. So with that being said, now we understood like, what is this ngFor doing. So what is the ngFor doing is, if you come back to the screen, so it is just iterating through that array and printing each of these element one by one. So if you are not able to see it, I will just zoom it. Yeah. So you can see it like, it is just printing each of these element one by one. So coming back, this is like, classic use case of using a structured directive. I'll just give you another example as well. So let's go back to the component and here, let me just use these two temporary variables that we created and give it some random value. So one, I would give it as A and the second, I would give it as B. Okay. So now coming back and using the same example, so now let's try to understand like, what we have done with this ngIf over here. So I've just defined two div over here. I just said div ngIf, and what we have done over here is I've defined one variable called temp1, give it a value of 1, and I've defined another variable called temp2, given it the value of b. And on my screen, I'm telling my HTML that if temp1 value matches 1, this triple equal to means that it has to exactly match the same type and value. So if I say temp1 triple equal to 1, then I have to display this text on the screen. And similarly for temp2, what I'm saying is if the value is not equal to A, then even this condition passes. So as you know, on temp2, we have given the value of B. So this condition also passes. If you come back to the HTML, you see that, both of these condition passes, and now I'm able to kind of see the values. So now let's try to play around with this and see what happens in other scenarios. So here in case of 1, I just give it like 0, 1 or like, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0. And instead of A, I give it like, something like B, which is the original value. So in this case, you see that both my like, div is not available over here. Why is that so? Because this condition has failed. So what your Angular will do is it will automatically remove this entire div from your view itself or the DOM itself. So DOM is nothing but if you like, inspect your like, just click on this inspect on your browser, you'll see something like HTML over here, right? And if you expand it, these are nothing but all these individual elements are nothing but the DOM, called as the DOM in your HTML page, which are nothing but the individual elements which you see on the screen. So what your Angular does is it will kind of manipulate each of these elements based on the conditions you write. So as you can see over here, our Angular has just commented out these two div over here. You will see that div itself is not present, but you see that, it has put a comment over here stating that, this ngIf has been evaluated to false and this has been evaluated to false. And similarly, we have iterated an array over here using ngFor if. So this is just for your understanding, right? So coming back, this is how you also kind of manipulate your DOM using either ngFor or ngIf. So that is the way we do it. So proceeding further, let's try to understand how does this the attribute directive looks like. Okay. So coming back to the attribute directives, uh, attribute directives, as I said, they won't modify the structure of your DOM element itself. By structure, I mean the actual visibility or the placement of it, but rather they would just give it some additional properties or modify the visibility or the properties of it. Okay, the attributes of it rather. So let's try to understand it, how can we do it and get it to know it. So basically using attributes, you can pass some styles to the add some style to the whatever DOM element you have, or you can give it some class names, so on and so forth, right? And also understand one more thing, directives are of two categories. Like as I said, one is you can define it either as a structural attribute or component, but there also can be inbuilt directives, or you can define your own custom directive as well. So what I mean by that is, it's not always necessary that you have to use only this ngFor or ngIf which is provided by the Angular CLIT. If you have your own, you want to define your own directives, you can also do that. We'll also understand how to do it further sections, but for now you just understand that it's not necessary that you have to only use the built-in directives and other things. You can also define your own custom directives as well. So coming back to the attribute directives, where we say they only modify or adjust the attributes of the component. So let's try to do it. So I will take a hypothetical situation, right, for the same scenario. So say assume I have a scenario wherein if my say assume if the variable of my temp1 is say assigned the value 1, I want to style my div in a particular way, right? So let's just see how can we do that. So one thing you can see is if you make any mistakes, your code editor itself will give you the error, what is the issue and how can you fix it. So let's just quickly fix it, and we'll come back to what we are doing right now. Okay. So what we have done over here is, in the earlier example that you see, the whatever directive started with this asterisk, which means it is a structural directive. So in these scenarios, we were kind of adding a new DOM element or we were removing a new DOM element, right? So, but in case of attribute directives, as I said, what we are essentially doing is we are just kind of manipulating the properties of the DOM element. And for that, the way to identify any attribute directives, we use this square brackets over here, right? So in this case, we are just taking a simple example. So what we are doing is we are altering the style properties of this particular div. And what we are doing is if it matches a particular condition, which in our case, if we are telling that if matches number 1, then we just change the color of that particular div to red, if not black. And similarly, if the temp2 matches the letter B, then make it red, if not black. So let's try to check if this works or not. If you come back, you'll see that both of these has passed the test, and that's why you're seeing this in red color. So what if we make any changes to it? So we say if temp1 is not equal to 1, say for example. So in that case, what happens is your temp1 now will now become black. And why is that so? Because when your Angular parses this, it will see that the value of temp1 is 1, but you are seeing the condition it should not be 1, which is false, right? So that's the reason instead of red, it will assign black to this style color property. And that's why on the HTML, you see it as a black color. Okay. So I hope that makes sense. So coming back, what I want you to understand is this attribute directive is not something it just there is a bunch of attributes. You can see for whatever attributes you have in your default HTML tag, right? I'll give you a simple example. Say you have like a button, for example, right? And a button can have something called a attribute called as disabled, right? So even for this disabled attribute, which is a built-in HTML attribute, you can make it an attribute directive just by putting the square bracket around it. And you can define, like, if you want to disable it based on some conditions. Say for example, I just want to disable this button when, say, my my temp2 value is equal to B. I'm just putting a hypothetical condition, right? And now if you see that, since my temp2 value is B, this button is disabled by default. And if, say, I change it to some value, if I say not equal to B, so now you see that, now my button has been enabled. So this is how you, like, you add the attribute directives. So what is the key takeaway over here is directives are of three types, right? So let's go back to the drawing board. So basically you need to understand that directives are of three types. So one is the structural directives. Structural directives, they basically alter your DOM structure itself. So the example of that would be your ngIf, your ngFor, right? These are the two main structured directives that we have. The second is your attribute directives. So attribute directives are nothing but they just alter the properties of your DOM element. By properties, I mean the look and feel of it. The example of that could be, as we saw, one could be your ng style, it could be your ngClass, and, like, any of the other HTML attributes that you have. So if you enclose any of these HTML attribute in a square bracket, that kind of acts as a attribute directives. If you would have noticed in my example over here, I had used, like, style dot color dot something, right? But here I gave you an example of ng style. So what is the meaning of that is, so here I'm just modifying just a single, what you say, a property of style, and that's why I've just directly used style dot color. But in your real-time scenario, there may be scenarios where, like, you have to modify a bunch of styles. So in those kind of scenarios, you could use ng style. But the best practice would be, like, you could also alter the class of your particular div using ngClass. So let's try to see even that as well. So say assume, like, I need to have, like, modify the class, like, dynamically add a class to my class name to my div based on the some conditions. So what I will do is I'll just take the same example. Okay. So what I've done over here is I've just used another example over here. So say example, like, I need to dynamically add a bunch of like styling properties to this particular div based on some condition. So instead of manually writing a very big style over here, what I could do is I could just define the ng class. So ng class is nothing but a built-in attribute directive given to you by Angular team. So wherein by which you can, based on some condition, apply a class name to a particular div dynamically, right? So in this case, what I'm trying to check is, I'm trying to check if the condition, if my temp1 equals to 1, and if that is the case, I'm saying that please apply this class name of temp1, and if not, just give it a class name of nothing. And if you don't need to, like, assign anything, any name to your div, if the condition fails, you can also give it as null. So that is also fine. But you have to ensure that, if you give it a null, just ensure that, you put it under a string. Yeah. And similarly, like, in my second case, what I'm saying is, if I'm like, in my second check, I'm just checking that, if this temp value matches B, and if that's the case, I give it a class name of temp2, or I just give it as nothing, which is also under a string. Okay. So now let's go and check if this has been activated or not. So what I'll do now is I'll just take the right click on this particular div over here, click on inspect, and when you click on inspect, right, you would see over here that in this div, right, there is something called as a class name added over here, and here you see the name of temp1 added, and similarly for the temp2, you see that, the class temp2 is also added by default. So just to check if it is working still fine, we'll just go and slightly modify the condition. So instead of, say, if my condition passes, I don't want to give it temp1, but rather I want to give it as temp pass, and here I just give it as, like, temp double pass, just some random names. If you come back and see, like, once the application is reloaded, you see that, now in my DOM, the class name has been updated as temp pass and temp double pass. So this is what is the use of using Angular class. So the advantage of using this class is, now what I can do is, inside my style, right, inside my this app component.scss file, I could define this class name, and but using temp paste pass is not a valid name, so I'll just give it as underscore. So just a minute, I just modify the code a bit. So just for your understanding, like what we can do with the class. So I can just define a bunch of CSS properties over here. So I can tell it red. I can give it a font size of maybe 16. And similarly for temp double pass, I could give it a color of green, and I could give it a font size of say maybe 18, and a bunch of other things as well. So these are the the advantage of using CSS, the ng class. You can do this instead of loading your DOM itself with too much of style things, inline style things. You can directly define them as a class and just import that class name over here. So if I come back to my DOM and I mistakenly added the inverted comma. Yeah, that was the issue. So now if you come back, you'll see that, now whatever styles we added for that particular class, you can see it over here. And how can you check it? How can you debug it? That's also important. So if I just right click on this particular element, that gets highlighted, and on the right hand side, you'll see what are the corresponding styles that are added, right? So here you see on the, if you make a mistake, like, this also I'm teaching you how to debug it. So you make a mistake and, that shows a strike through. So what it means is this property name is invalid. So what you can do is, font size usually needs a pixel, so all you need to do is just add the word px after it, and now you would see on your browser that it has been added. So you can see that this has a smaller size and this has a bigger size, and on the right hand side you are able to see it. So these are some basic debugging tips as well for you. And if there are any major issues, if you go to the console, you will see that error over here. For now we don't have error, but if you have any errors, you would see that over here as well. So let me just try to just force and do an invalid operation and show you how error looks like. So say for example here for temp2 I just added as temp3 for example. You'd see now my Angular has thrown an error, and it tells me temp it underlines the word temp3 and says that top property temp3 does not exist. Did you mean temp1? So what you need to do is you first check in the console what is the file number on which the error is being thrown. So if you come over here, it will tell you that on app component HTML line number 21, this is the variable which has error. So come back, see that line number 21 and temp3. Now we know that there's no variable called temp3, so we change it back to temp2, and this how the error get resolved. So most of the debugging things you do in this fashion, wherein you just check what is the error in the console, just go back to the code and see if you can fix it, and if not, I told you earlier there is a site called as stackoverflow.com, right? So you can search whatever error you get over here, and that will help you to get a quick answer as well. So this is one site which I highly recommend to all of you. So as you keep on doing your own projects, assignments, and try to learn Angular in your free time, I'm sure that definitely you would get a bunch of errors in your console. And if you feel you're lost or you're not able to get quick answers to it, you can definitely just search for it over here, and that will help you to get it. So for example, let's take the same issue over here. So if I just say I just try to give some random number, like random variable name, and it throws me error over here, right? So what I can do is I can just search for this particular error in type Stack Overflow, right? Yeah. So if I search for this particular error on the Stack Overflow, I would see a bunch of questions which are asked on the similar lines, like what I need, what is being done. So if you click on one of these, so there will be a question which will be similar to what you would have asked, and there will be a bunch of answers which the other developers would have given. So what you can do is you can go through each one of them, starting from the first one and then the subsequent ones, and then you can understand how can you resolve that particular error. So this was one way you can easily get answers to any of the issues. And with that, just reverted back. Yeah. So yeah, so now everything is working fine. And so with that, we have come to the end of the second session, where you have learned a bit about what is directives, what is attribute directives, and what is structural directives. And looking forward to see you guys in the next session. Thank you.